When we say pre-code, which is a really easy, quick, label that we put to films made before 1934 that are like this, it's really about pre-Hays Code. And in the 1920s, increasingly during the innovative times of the silent era, films depicted a lot of things that you didn't maybe think that they depicted. Sex, violence, homosexuality, drugs, you name it, the vice was on the screen. And lots of films that were really made for adult audiences and not necessarily in a rated R way. And after a while, with all these films coming out and the studios really, they knew sex sells, violence sells, gangster films were hot. The different censor boards that cropped up around the country were trying to enforce their own morals on the films and literally cutting scenes out and things of that nature. And finally, the studios realized, you know what? If we let them censor, it's going to go to the next level and the government is going to start censoring films. So why don't we put our own restrictions in place and we'll self-police ourselves. So they hired Will Hays, who is a former Postmaster General, head of the Republican National Committee, which will probably shock no one here. And if you Google his name, a photo of him will come up, and he really looks like someone who really had no fun. So he was perfect for the job, I'm sure. So he developed a code which impacted so many things to come after, including early television. I don't know about you, but if you remember watching I Love Lucy when you were a kid, you might have thought, why are Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball in different beds? They're married. And that all stems back to the Hays Code, where they didn't want to depict sex in a certain way. They cleaned up the language. They made sure the good guy always won. And that code was written in 1930. This movie was obviously made in 1933, but they weren't necessarily totally enforcing it at that time, which is why this film is considered pre-code. The code was really enforced after 1934, and so that's where we get this definition of pre-code. What I find so interesting about this film is that it is totally escapism, which is something that Depression-era audiences were looking for in spades and why they were going to the movies frequently every single week. But it's also got some really incredible, heartfelt, real moments of what it took to survive the Depression and what real life was like for people at that time. So somehow it balances both. Mm-hmm. And it does that in a really extraordinary way, especially with its very unique musical number ending, which I'll get to in a minute. But think about the context of when this movie was made. In 1933, when they were shooting this film, literally they were shooting the musical scenes. FDR had just been inaugurated on March 4th, and a couple of days later, he shuts down the banks for 4 days because they need a reset. And FDR won because Hoover was completely unable to handle the situation, was clearly not going to get reelected. And a year before this movie was made was something called the Bonus Army March, which I'll talk more about in a moment, but it was a group of World War I veterans who went to DC because of how they felt they were being maltreated by the government and others during the Depression. So that's all sort of in the background. The director of this film is credited as Mervyn LeRoy, and he certainly directed parts of the film. But what's interesting about this movie is that you'll also see a credit for Busby Berkeley right after the And I think a lot of people think of this film as a Busby Berkeley film, and I think that's a really inaccurate way to think about this movie. He was shooting the musical scenes separate from what Mervyn LeRoy was doing, and somehow it kind of all sews together. But it's really Berkeley who's responsible for the most memorable parts of this film. And he was a successful stage choreographer on Broadway for a number of years during the silent era, and then made the transition into talkies when musicals became all the rage, when sound came in. So it was really good timing for him. So thinking about some of the key musical moments in this film, the first one you'll see is Pettin' in the Park. And when I mentioned that this film was made in '33, this was released this way, but they were already kind of doing some alternate takes for certain scenes for certain cities. They knew, let's get around that. But when this movie was re-released in 1935, you couldn't see Pettin' in the Park, and you'll see why. Another incredible sequence, it's called the Shadow Waltz, and you may have seen clips of this if you haven't seen the film, because it's so remarkable. He took his group of girls with violins, and electrified the violins. He made them neon, so that he could create these extraordinary geometric patterns as he shot. And he was known, as you'll see in the film, he was known for really shooting these shots from above. The studios that he shot in were roughly 40 feet, but he actually punched through the ceilings of some of the studios, much to the dismay of the Warner Brothers. They were not happy with him for that. But perhaps the most impactful musical number will be the last one that you see, and it's called Remember My Forgotten Man. I doubt you'll see another movie that ends on a note like this. But one thing I found interesting was that Busby Berkeley was a World War I veteran. He was a lieutenant in the Army, and I found this great nugget of information you should think of when you see this particular musical sequence. As a lieutenant, he was responsible for drilling up to 1,200 men at once. So this is really where he started to get the chops of thinking about, how do I take a giant group of people and have them all stop on a dime and do this and do that? And he did that in World War I. But it's hard not to think about his personal service when you consider all of those real world incidents, the veterans marching in DC the previous year, and just what everyone was going through with the Depression. And I think it's quite moving. So I just want to say a few words about the cast. I love stories like this from the early 30s, working girls, organizing themselves to survive and also find success. And there are a whole bunch of amazing pre-code actors in this film. Joan Blondell, if you don't know her, you'll probably recognize her from something. She, was an amazing character actor. And one of her last roles was actually in Grease. She worked for a very long time. She was a waitress at the diner in that movie. Ruby Keeler and Dick Powell in this film. Yeah, the magic couple. They did 42nd Street before this film, but then they did 4 other films after that together, or it might have been 7 actually, 7 films altogether. And they were a huge hit in the 30s. I also have to admit, I was not aware of this until today. Joan Blondell was married to Dick Powell for 6 years. They married in 1936, so interesting cross connections there. Aileen McMahon, another amazing character actor. This is probably one of her best known films. She just has these great one-liners. You'll know her when you see her. And of course, Ginger Rogers, who is the smiling face that we see at the top of the film, dressed in gold coins and little else. And she'd been working in movies for 4 years at this point. When you think movies in early Hollywood, you definitely think Dream Factory. And it was a factory. She made 10 films in 1933. This was just one of them. But one of the others was Flying Down to Rio, which paired her for the first time with Fred Astaire, and we know where the rest of the story goes from there. She actually performs We're in the Money in Pig Latin, so you'll see that. And a fun little story, she apparently was the one responsible for that. She was rehearsing, and she was trying to warm up, and she did all the lyrics in Pig Latin. And the producer saw it and said, I want to include that in the film. So that was totally her idea. I am so excited that you're here tonight to enjoy Gold Diggers of 1933. And if for no other reason, because you should see it together and on the big screen as it's meant to be seen, especially to see Busby Berkeley's genius, because it is genius. And remember, there's no CGI. These are all real people. So enjoy the film.